Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear alumni, dear friends, partners of the MCI, dear audience, wherever you may be now, I'm more than pleased to welcome you today to this distinguished guest online live talk at MCI, the Entrepreneurial School. It is a great honor and pleasure to be today with you and to present to you our distinguished guest of today. He is the chief executive of a multinational company. Let me express a warm gratitude and welcome to Dr. Severin Schwan, chief executive of Roche Group. Happy to have you with us, Severin. Welcome.
Thank you, Andreas, and thanks for having me.
You're sitting in Basel now, aren't you?
I am, yeah, actually I am.
Now, Severin, you have been with the Roche Group since 1993, if I'm not mistaken, and you've studied at the University of Innsbruck first. I think it was economics and law, and then moved on to York and to Oxford, but started your career quite early at Roche. Would you want to briefly describe the keystones, the key elements of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to work in a more international environment, and that's the reason why I applied at Roche. I had the opportunity back then to work and start as a finance trainee. And actually one of the reasons why I joined Roche was when I had my discussions there with the people. They told me, well, if you join this program and if you don't go abroad after a relatively short period of time, then actually we have to fire you again. And there were other reasons why I joined Roche, but it was one of the reasons why I joined the company, because they were very serious about offering an international career path, and I kind of wanted to see the world. I started back then as a finance trainee. Actually, I would never have thought that I would stay for my entire career. I think I would actually have felt a bit embarrassed if a colleague has asked me, and I would have said that I stay with one company for the rest of my professional life. But one opportunity after another came, and I never had even the time or any reason to think about going somewhere else. And then at some point I got CEO, and it was quite a journey. I started in finance. I was working in one of our divisions in diagnostics, later on in pharma, went into general management. I worked in Belgium, in Germany, Singapore before I came back to Switzerland. Here we go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, wasn't it quite unusual at the time of your when you entered your career that you wanted to go abroad? Especially you come from Innsbruck, from the Tyrol. And the world has been opening up, and Austria has been becoming part of the European Union, and technology and media and mindset has been changing. But at that time, when you were young, was that usual or unusual?
It was rather unusual, but I think it even started a bit earlier, and that was during the studies. So you mentioned that I was part of my studies in the UK, and at that time, Austria was not part of the European Union, and it was quite an effort to organize some studies abroad, right? And get all the exams recognized in Innsbruck, etc., right? And that was certainly a very, how shall I say, important step back then. I got actually great support from some professors in Innsbruck who kind of made sure that there was not too much bureaucracy. and it worked out. And I went there with my girlfriend, with whom I'm married today. I think that was really the starting point. You know, when you go once abroad, and if it's a positive experience, then kind of, you know, if you like it, you don't want to miss it anymore. And I think it was at that time that it became increasingly clear for me that I'd like to work in a more international environment.
Now, Roche, we have been talking about Roche, and Roche more or less has two key elements, key industries within one group. And you are Mr. Roche now. I mean, not a family member, but the chief executive. What would you say is the key elements of Roche? That may be the industries, the technology, or it may also be the markets, or however you would like to describe that.
Yeah, so first of all, at Roche, it's all about improving patients' lives, and we do this in two businesses. One is pharmaceuticals, the development and commercialization of medicines. And then we are also market leader in diagnostics, in so-called in vitro diagnostics. So this is whenever you have a blood test or a genetic test, it's very likely that this test will be performed on a Roche Diagnostics platform. And the strategy actually is a lot about what we refer to as personalized healthcare. So kind of 15 years ago, we started to develop a strategy where we said we want to target medicines to those patient groups who benefit most from the medicine, and that was increasingly possible because of modern diagnostics, molecular diagnostic, genetic testing. And it's in particular important in very heterogeneous diseases like cancer, where people respond very differently to the same treatment. So if you better understand the differences of the patient groups, their genetic setup, for example, then you can target the medicine much better to the individual patient. And at Roche, as we have been in both pharma and diagnostics, that was kind of an obvious opportunity for us. We could make it our kind of core strategy to drive personalized healthcare by working together between diagnostics and pharmaceuticals to develop these much more targeted medicines. And what that means is for patients, they really work the medicines, so you're not wasting medicines or actually even risking side effects for patients who do not benefit from the medicine. And also it's much more efficient from a healthcare system point of view because you don't have the wastage in the system. So that has been very much our strategy, and that's what we continue to work on now. And we'll speak later about this. That's the topic of our session, I guess. The digitalization in healthcare gets a very important component on top of it, but it's really at the core of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have been agreeing upon one topic, a key topic, which is digitalization and innovation, and how this is related to, how digitalization is related to innovation, and innovation is related to success. How do you keep such a multinational company with, I think, 100,000 employees and 60 billion, an annual turnover of 60 billion Swiss francs? How can you keep such a company agile? And I think you've been preparing some slides. Would you want to dive into this topic with your slides? And before you get started, I would invite the audience, encourage the audience, and remind the audience that there is the opportunity to send questions. The questions can be sent to livetalk@mci.edu. I repeat, livetalk@mci.edu, and they will come on my screen, and I will do my best to bring them in at the Q&A session after the little presentation of Dr. Severin Schwan. So please feel invited, and now it's your floor, Dr. Severin Schwan.
Thank you. Yeah, so really the focus of my introduction is about digitalization. I have an echo in the line. Is it on your side, Andreas?
I do not hear any echo.
Okay, good. Perhaps if you go on mute, I lose it. Could that help?
All right.
Okay, that's much better. Much better. Great. So really, I'd like to focus on digitalization, and you just wonder, I mean, that sounds a bit almost old-fashioned these days, as other industries have already fully digitalized. If you, I mean, think of media or retail, finance, etc. But the reality is healthcare is lagging behind. And I think many of us have become acutely aware during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is a huge opportunity, and the one topic I would like to focus in particular is data which we can now collect in the real world. We call this kind of data real world data, and just to put this into perspective. Typically, when you develop a diagnostics or a medicine, what you do is a clinical trial. Under very controlled circumstances, you have patients participating in a clinical trial, you collect the data, and you look at the data and see whether a diagnostics or a medicine works, right? Clinical trials will remain very important in the future, but the limitation of clinical trials is that they are always limited in scope, naturally, because you can only include so many patients in a clinical trial. And what is happening now is a real fundamental shift in healthcare, and that is a lot of healthcare data, patient data, can be recorded in a digital way. Now, for you who are perhaps not in the healthcare sector, you say, okay, I mean, seems pretty obvious. I tell you, it's not so obvious. And probably many of us have the experience. If you go to your doctor, there is still, you know, a physical file where the doctor would take notes, write a prescription, etc. And eventually this file, you know, goes into an archive and you never get the data back, you know, and yeah, the reality is there's an enormous treasure in this data, in this real world data. And if we perhaps can just click on the next slide. So real world data, what we mean by that is diagnostic data. It's treatment data. So if you have a patient with a certain diagnosis, then you would have to treat the patient in some form, and then you have an outcome, which basically means how well does the patient respond. You know, this happens every day, a million times in the clinical practice in the real world. And you can immediately see that if we could digitalize this data, if we could record that data, if we can aggregate that data, and if we can analyze the data, this is an enormous treasure. Which allows you to gain a lot of insights beyond what you would be able to see with the traditional clinical trials, right? Now, I'd like to make one point here, because in the public understanding, it's perhaps not always so clear. It's a bit blurred, the understanding, but this is really, really, really decisive. There is, on the one hand, a need to work with what we call identifiable data, so that you know who is the patient behind the data, right? So if a doctor deals with the data, then of course, you know, if you come to the doctor, you have a doctor visit, and the doctor, you know, wants to make a treatment decision, then instead of pulling out all the paper, the doctor would take out the electronic record, and of course that's identifiable because the doctor has to know who is the patient, right? And it's individualized. So in the healthcare sector itself, at the doctor in a hospital, you need identifiable data, right? However, if you want to develop a medicine then it's completely irrelevant who is the individual patient behind the data. So all what we are interested in the industry for research and development purposes, or for that matter also academia, is de-identified data, anonymized data, right? Now I stress this because there is so much concern about data privacy, rightly so, etc. Frankly, also the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry has a bit suffered from all the issues we have seen in the tech industry, right? With Facebook and Google and what have you. Now, there is this fundamental difference, right? Because in Facebook, you are identifiable, right? I mean, you are perhaps not by name, but at least with the IP address, and the business model behind this is advertising, right? And the more personalized it is, and the better you get back to the individual IP address, the better the business model of those companies works. That's the very essence of the business model. Now, this is completely different in the pharmaceutical industry, because what you need is aggregated, de-identified data. You don't care who the patient is. At Roche, for example, we have currently about over 300,000 patients on clinical trials. We have constantly patients on clinical trials, about 300,000. You can imagine how much data we collect every day. And we do this for 100 years. But nobody knows who is the patient behind it. All these data are de-identified, we aggregate it, and we use that for research purposes, right? And by the way, I should also say that there is a lot of criticism about our industry, and our reputation suffers in a number of countries, but I've never heard anybody complain about data privacy in this industry. So if there's one thing which this industry really knows to deal with, is privacy of data, and we have done this for decades. It's also highly regulated, unlike in the consumer area. On the one hand, it's a problem, because we face the general public concern, where I think it's really a different story for us. On the other hand, it's also an advantage, because we have all these established relationships with hospitals, academic institutions, and they know that. And that's also why they want to work together with us on real-world data questions. So it goes both directions, right? Because we have these long-standing relationships. But it's a fundamental point, and something people are not always aware of when we talk about data privacy, etc. But this is fundamental. Now, if we can go to the next slide. I have only 3 slides, so don't worry. Here I've just I mean, it's all fine, but so what's give me an example how are real world data helping us. Now that's an example for the development of a new medicine. Now very specifically here I've taken one of our medicines which we have developed a couple of years ago. It's called alectinib, and this is a cancer medicine where the hypothesis was that it would work for a very, very specific form of lung cancer, a lung cancer with a very specific mutation. It's called ALK mutation, and only a very small subgroup of lung cancer patients have this mutation in the cancer, and therefore we thought, this medicine would, we thought this medicine would work particularly well for those patients, but it wouldn't work for any other patients, right? You need this mutation, because the way this drug works, it blocks exactly where this mutation happens. So now a traditional trial, like kind of most trials, would work where you have a medicine, you have a placebo, and you give half of the group, say 100 patients, you give the medicine, and another 100 patients, we call that comparator arm, you give a placebo or the other standard therapy which is already available. And then, you treat the patients, and afterwards you look of whether the people with the new medicine, in this case alectinib, live longer than the people who took the standard therapy. So that's a typical clinical trial we would do. Now, the problem here with this trial was that there was a standard therapy, and nobody knew whether alectinib would work. So doctors and patients were a bit hesitant to take the risk of a new medicine. But the worst was that you then don't even know whether you're on the active arm or on the passive arm, right? Because of all of that, we ran into the problem that we couldn't recruit enough patients, right? Normally, in the old world, what that would have meant is the end of the story, right? If you cannot recruit enough patients to prove that the medicine works, you cannot develop the drug. It's as simple as that. So what people said is, let's try a new approach. And what I should say here is we have entered a collaboration at the time with a company in the United States called Flatiron. And they had records. They had records of lung cancer patients, right? And they also had records, because they had a huge number of patients in their records, they had also patients there who had this ALK mutation, right? And what we did is we said, okay, let's take a new approach. We give the medicine to the active arm, so we only need half of the patients to recruit, right? Much easier. And for the rest, we actually do a virtual arm. That is, we just look retrospectively into the database and we pick out all these patients who were treated with the standard therapy and we look how they responded to the drug, right? And then we compare whether we get better results with the new medicines. That was possible because we had this good database in this specific case. And it turned out that we got a very strong signal that alectinib is an improvement over the standard of care. And what happened as a consequence is that the regulators allowed a conditional approval for this medicine. They said, well, this is a strong enough signal and the disease is so severe that we bring these medicines to patients, even though we don't have a traditional full-fledged clinical trial, right? They also made the condition that based on that, we have then to still run a full trial because they wanted to see whether it's really true what we saw with this virtual arm. As a result of it, the medicine got into clinical practice. We did these trials, and what was interesting to see, this was the first kind of this trial ever actually. What we saw is that the result of the real traditional trial was exactly the same as the one with this virtual arm where we used retrospective data, and that gave a real kind of momentum to this idea of using real-world data for such purposes, both with regulators and with the industry. So you immediately see the enormous value of real-world patient data, because if you have these kind of data, you can develop a medicine in the first place, which otherwise would never have come to patients. And today, by the way, is the standard of care for those kind of patients. It goes faster, and we can add a lot of benefits. So I think this is a wonderful example, and that is one of many. And I with the time, I have to focus on one of those. Now, I have one more slide before we go into the discussion. And I thought, well, I mean, coming to Austria, I can perhaps also reflect a little bit of, my outside perspective on where does Austria stand in terms of digitalization in healthcare. And I would say the following. On the one hand, I think Austria would be a wonderful country to leverage these opportunities. To start with, because there's an excellent healthcare system. There's just, really a high standard of care, which is very important, because if the standard of care is not good, then, you have other priorities, and also for the industry, it's not very interesting. You cannot do even these trials, right? You need really very high qualified partners, which we of course find in Austria. Number two, Austria has as a nucleus introduced patient records, the so-called ELGA system, which is not granted. If you look to Germany, if you look to Switzerland, they don't have that, right? So there is still a lot of work to do, and it's not perfect yet, but it's a starting point, there's no doubt, and it has been implemented now for some time. And I understand it was also at least to a certain degree helpful in the COVID-19 crisis, where high-risk patients could be identified via ELGA because the patient history was in the system. And as a result of it, those patients could get a special proactive warning. They could be invited to vaccinations, etc. So it already showed up that there was something to build on. And in other countries in Europe, there was no such possibility whatsoever. So there is already something here. And I would also say, with whomever I speak in Austria, academic institutions, hospitals, and also politicians, there is I think, a genuine interest to be a leader and to make progress in this field. On the one hand, of course, to provide better healthcare, but also to make Austria more attractive as a country for the life science industry and to attract R&D investment. So there's a lot we could build on in Austria. On the other hand, the execution is really poor. I mean, really poor. So kind of there's everything there, and then we kind of stumble and get nothing done, kind of. I mean, I'm a bit perhaps extreme, but little done given the opportunities we would have. So I give you on the right-hand side of this slide, there are three very specific things which actually you could fix very easily, but for some reason it doesn't happen. Now, one is that Austria, which again is a very good thing, established regulation on how to deal with real-world data, right? It's called the Forschungsorganisationsgesetz from 2018. And that law is a good law, and it actually provides the opportunity to share data, de-identified data, anonymized data, with academia and with industry for research purposes, right? I mean, it's written in the law is very clear. This law, however, can only be enacted if you have an administrative order, right? So the next level kind of directives, if you like, have to be written, otherwise you cannot implement the law. It's just how it works in Austria. Now, there was media concerns, right? There was talking rounds on the ORF and what have you, and people were concerned about data privacy. Of course, they didn't get the difference between identified and de-identified data, and it was all over the place. It was also before COVID-19, I should say. I'm absolutely sure the discussion would be different today. And as a result of it, the politicians leaned back and never wrote this administrative directives, right? So we have a wonderful legal basis, which again is a good thing, because in many other countries you don't even have that. But we don't implement it. And as a result of it, nobody can do the research, right? And nobody could do something in Austria, which we did, for example, in the US with this example of alectinib, right? And as a consequence, even if we wanted to, we cannot do the clinical trials in Austria, which is a real pity, right? Not to speak about the opportunity to establish an industry in Austria. I mean, you can't do it. If you're not allowed to do it, you can't do it. It's as simple as that. Now, second one is data privacy. Now, of course, extremely important. And also the industry relies on a solid framework. But, you know, there is a special Austrian finish to that, which goes beyond the European regulations. So, for example, telemedicine. Now, in many countries today, telemedicine is standard, right? And COVID-19 has accelerated this big time, right? And in Austria, what you need is an electronic signature. Now, this goes beyond what is the European regulations. You know, this is some level beyond. Now, this is so complicated and so cumbersome that as a result of it, to my knowledge, only one of the payers, the Krankenkassen, the SVS, has somehow found a way to implement it, and the rest is given up. So therefore, telemedicine, unlike in other countries where this is booming, in Austria is basically still at a very low level for reasons which are difficult to understand. And then the third one, which is very important if you want to attract industry, is that there is no reimbursement for digital solutions, right? So a hospital might kind of pay for it out of the general budget, but in the ambulant field, etc., it's just a reality. If something is not reimbursed, it will not be used. That's just what it is. And there's no incentive for hospitals, for doctors, for the industry, of course, to launch such solutions. So because digital solutions are treated in a different way and they are not reimbursed, of course, nobody uses them, which is a pity. So on the one hand, and this is different to a number of European countries. If you look to Germany, for example, it is reimbursed, and as a result of it, there are lots of innovations in this field now coming to the market, and Austria loses the opportunity, really, not only for the industry, more importantly also for for patients who could be taken care in a much better form. So that's kind of a bit where I stand. On the one hand, an enormous opportunity, a lot of stuff which is there, right? The fundamentals are all in place, and then you just wonder, why the hell can't we get it done? Now, we have not given up. We have a number of initiatives with institutions in Austria, and eventually we'll get there. But my hope really is with COVID-19 that also the public opinion is shifting, and as such, the politicians have a bit more courage to implement those measures. Where if you talk with them in private, they say, of course it makes sense, but it's too hot of a potato for me to touch. So anyway, yeah, it took me a bit longer than I thought. Sorry, Andreas. But let's get into the more interactive part. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Severin, for sharing your expertise and also so honestly speaking about or expressing your impressions about Austria, or I mean about the pharmaceutical industry in general. For instance, what I was quite astonished that you so frankly spoke about that digitalization, which you would be expecting, especially present in the healthcare industry, is not really. I mean, there is potential for improvement in every industry, but really, we are in the Stone Age.
We are in the Stone Age as an industry, really in the Stone Age.
And you have been poking the wound of Austria. I think it was, I mean, it came into my mind, Grillparzer. Dies ist der Fluch von unserem Hohen Haus, mit halben Mitteln zu halber Tat, zauderhaft zu schreiten. So, I mean, to keep it short and translate it into English, to always stay or be satisfied too early. Perhaps that would be a diplomatic way to translate it. Now, Severin, I have been receiving quite a number of questions, and I may perhaps start with one or two from myself, which I have been marking down. Now, when we talk about digitalization and perhaps even more generally about innovation, what would you think is the key bottlenecks in your industry or in the healthcare or pharmaceutical industry in general, the key problems to overcome? Every industry has bottlenecks. The one is regulation, the other one is finance, another one is culture, market, finance, whatever you may, or HR. What are the key bottlenecks in your industries?
Very clear. It's the complexity of the human body. It's the disease biology. That is, I mean, enormously complex, and that's the basis of everything else. If you understand the biology of a disease, if you understand what is going wrong, right? Very often it's useful if you know how things work if they are not going wrong, but if you want to develop a medicine, then you also have to know on top what is going wrong. And the human body and the complexity of diseases is enormous, right? And if you master that understanding, and you know, we're always scratching at the surface, and there's so much more we have to better understand. But every time we understand something in addition, you know, that offers new opportunities. For example, my example with this ALK mutation, right? I mean, for centuries, we didn't know that there are some cancers who have the ALK mutation, right? The moment we understood that certain cancers are particularly aggressive because there is a special mutation of one of these proteins along the pathways, which of course was only possible to be understood with better science, with modern diagnostics, etc. Suddenly we had something we call a target. Because if you know where things are going wrong, then you can target that, you can inhibit it, you can knock it out, you can do all kinds of things with it. But that is the basis, right? So it's the bottleneck at the end of the day is the complexity of diseases. And that's why I believe it's so important to have cutting edge science, to work closely together with academic institutions, with universities, to be really at the cutting edge. To really know what's going on, to partner with the right companies, to bring all this know-how into the company which is relevant to develop a medicine.
Another question now related, especially at the linkage between academia and industry. Now, I mean, research by principle is being done at universities. On the other hand, you see very, very little transformation, knowledge transfer, which really is brought to life, meaning that such an expertise coming out of the research of universities is really brought is really transformed into processes, into product, into business models and so on. This is being done more or less by the industries, and even more so, meanwhile, the key research, I assume, is being done in the industry, not so much in the academic field. How would you see that? What is the bottlenecks of the academic sector, if you may even want to address that? Why does not more transformation come out of the universities?
Yeah, I would challenge you a bit on that. I actually would argue that a lot of innovation which we see in healthcare, a lot of medicines and other innovations, actually if you go back and if you look where did the original insight come from, very often that happened in academic institutions and in the public domain. And what I would say is where academia and public institutions or independent private institutions in the US, like universities there, etc., are really good is in basic research. If you have a very, very long time frame, right? If you have to work on problems which perhaps will be applied in 20, 30, 40 years, right? This is where industry is just not working because the time frame is too long. But this is an area where academia can really provide breakthroughs and where it makes a lot of sense to invest for the public side. And I always keep saying, if you want to invest into innovation, if you want to get also an attractive place for the life science industry, put all the investments into basic research. Because out of this basic research, you get two things. One is the best people in the world, the Nobel Prize winner type of people, they want to do basic research. They do not want to kind of optimize something which has been there already for 10 years. So you attract great people. And that means you develop these hubs of talents, which are then extremely interesting for the pharma industry. If you look at the big hubs in the world, right, in the Bay Area, around Stanford, in Boston, in now increasingly in Shanghai, I should say, and then smaller hubs in Europe, they all are centered around very well-performing academic institutions, all of them. And the key reason is because the industry finds the talent there, right? And the rest then typically works almost kind of on itself. You have then startup companies in, you have big companies coming in, then you have venture capitalists coming in who want to make a lot of money, right? And you develop an ecosystem. And the two biggest ecosystems in the world for our life science industry is the Bay Area and Boston. You know, this is two worlds in their own, and then, you know, it's a big distance, and now you have Asia coming up, and then, you know, with a long distance, you have some centers in Europe. London, Oxford, Cambridge is one of them, Northwestern Switzerland is one of them. You don't have to worry anymore, if you like. This happens then automatically. And if I may make a link to Austria here again, in Austria, there is an attitude all the time, I've also talked to politicians about that, who asked me for advice, where they always say, well, we want applied research, we want to see something coming out of that. That's an illusion. That's the wrong approach. What you should take is all the money, put it into basic research, and the rest will happen on its own. And give these academic institutions autonomy. Let them do what they do, they will attract the best people, and that will feed the ecosystem. If you want to direct the money into some applied areas, first of all, you get it wrong in the first place, or by the time you would make your investment, science has already moved on. And thirdly, very important, these subsidies for industry are completely wasted money. Because I've never, ever, over all the years, taken an investment decision to develop a molecule because I got a subsidy from a government. Never, ever. I went there because there was the best science, because I got the best people, because there was a good infrastructure, etc. But never money. It's a waste of money. I mean, in German, we call this Mitnahme-effect. You know, if somebody forces me to take the money, fine, but I'm there anyway. It doesn't help anything. So I would say the best recipe, in my experience, is put a lot into exciting basic research, attracts people, will attract the ecosystem, and the rest works out on its own. And that's what you see at the successful hubs.
May I briefly come in here and then really look on my screen for the questions which have been coming in. But you have been mentioning, is it more the research you're interested in coming from academia, or are you more interested in the talent? You also mentioned talent, or I had the feeling it was even more so perhaps the talent side than the research outcome side.
And it goes hand in hand. So, for example, what we have in many of our research sites around the world, we recruit professors, well-known, renowned people who are really the stars in their respective field. And very often what they would say is, yeah, but I also want to keep my own lab and so on. And what we are gladly doing is we are working with their alma mater, and we have cooperations, you know, and all the postdocs are coming to us. So on the one hand, we get the talent, but as a result of it, we keep all these relationships and we get the research as well and all the insights. So it goes hand in hand. And it's a win-win, because the other way around, of course, those institutions work with us, then we develop a medicine, we do clinical trials, etc. By the way, this is also a big advantage which the US has. In the US, in healthcare, typically, these academic institutions are either linked to or actually own huge hospital networks, right? If you look at Stanford, for example, renowned research institution, and as part of the same institution, you have a huge hospital network. So that helps also on the translational side, because stuff which comes from research to industry, you can then bring back again into the same environment with the same researchers, and because at the end you have to bring it into the clinic, right? And you have to run clinical trials or use these real world data, which are also sitting in the hospital. That's a big issue here in Europe, not only in Austria, same in Switzerland and Germany, for example, that typically the academic institution is separate from the clinical operations, right? It's like the one is the research people and the other ones are the butchers, you know, the operating people. And you have lots of discussions about, you know, how can they work together? And you end up with these triangular relationships, right, with industry. And as you would expect, a triangular relationship is always much more difficult than a bilateral relationship. And very often, we are dealing almost like a catalyst or a matchmaker between those hospitals and related academic institutions, because they have infights and they are competing and they don't like each other and what have you. So that's a structural disadvantage which we see in Austria. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Severin. Now, to avoid potentially running out of time too early, I may really now come to the questions, or to at least some of them. Louis Lamshöft, he is an MCI student, has sent me a question, and that goes, would you say that the pharmaceutical industry requires such a high level of expertise that a lateral entry from a different industry is not possible for a chief executive position or a high or a C-level position?
It depends, of course, in which area you are working. I would argue if you are interested to get ahead of research and development in the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, there's so much specific expertise, and typically, certainly at Roche, you would have people who have typically had a career in research and development, people who are scientists or clinicians. It's very difficult for an outsider to take such a career path. But in other areas, of course, that's not necessarily the case, and I guess I'm the best example for that. I'm an economist and lawyer, and I love medicine and I love science. And in the meantime, I've had the opportunity to work with lots of scientists and I learn a lot of them. But my knowledge is superficial, kind of. Basically, I have no clue. I get a bit of a feel what environment it takes for scientists to thrive, but that's kind of what I can expect. So it shows that it's possible to take a leadership position in this industry if you are coming from another industry, or if you are not a scientist or a clinician. But if one day my successor is a clinician or a scientist, that would also be great. So it's not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chiara Spinelli, she sits in Verona now, has sent me a question. How much does it help that the founding family is still involved at Roche? I mean, especially related when it comes to long-term investments and long-term strategy.
I mean, it's invaluable. I mean, I'm privileged. I can just summarize it like that. This is such an advantage. It's incredible. And as a CEO, you really feel it, right? I never felt it really over all the years when I was at Roche. But when you get CEO, then you get also at this interface with the outside world, right? You face the pressure with investors, with media, etc. And then you learn to appreciate what it means if you have a strong shareholder who thinks in the long term. And if you would talk with our members of the founding families, Hoffmann-Oehry, they would say, I mean, what we really care about is that this company makes a contribution to society and that we hand it over in a good state to our children. Mm-hmm. And if they say this, is exactly what they mean. That's exactly what they mean. I mean, it's now handed over from the fourth to the fifth generation, right? Mm-hmm. We are celebrating 125 years at Roche this year. And they literally mean it like this. And what that means is they think 20, 30 years. That's exactly the time span of a generation. And it's a privilege. I could give you examples like no end, if you like. I mean, I give you one, just to make my point, because I do believe I'm so privileged here. Financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And, it was a difficult time for everybody, of course, and investors were extremely, extremely reluctant, right? to invest into research and development in particular. I mean, it was seen as a waste, and who knows whether ever something comes out of that, etc. Now, we happen to have a number of interesting opportunities, also expensive opportunities. And at that time, we were almost counter-cyclical, right? Where we invested over proportionally into R&D because we thought we had these opportunities. And, investors were mad at us. And I remember I just took over as the CEO. I will never forget that. I have to tell you the story. 2009, I had my first full year presentation, right? Midst of the financial crisis, right? And we said, well, we will invest more in R&D, and kind of, investors were really not happy. And then one of the investors, I mean, I was not very experienced at that time in communication, etc. And then one of the investors, an analyst, said, wasted money, spent like a drunken sailor, doesn't make sense, blah, blah, blah. And, my blood pressure was going up. And at some point I said, I mean, if you don't like it that we invest into R&D, take your money and invest it somewhere else, right? And what happened was the share price went down. These curves, I mean, you could watch it. I mean, it was a slump like this. And I'm not sure if I would have been the CEO of a public company whether I would even have survived that at the time. But it was, I think, in hindsight, the right thing to do, because a lot of innovations we have funded there are the medicines we are launching now. But I could only do that at the end of the day, apart from my bad communication, because I had the backing of the shareholders. I saw it with my colleagues at the time. They were all saving money in research, not all, but a number of them were saving money literally at the wrong place. When I privately talked with them, they said, I have no choice. I lose my job if I don't do it. If I don't raise the dividend, if I don't give money back to the shareholders because they don't believe in the future, whatever, I know I'm doing the wrong thing. I wish I was in your position. And you know what happened? 5 years later, they were fired because there was no pipeline. I mean, by the same investors, by the way. So I can just tell you, it's a huge privilege if you can do the right thing in the long term, and if you have the backing of your shareholders. That's a privilege which is incredible.
I mean, for this reason and for the specificities and the value of family enterprises, we at the MCI have been building up a family business center, taking care in research and also when it comes to career paths and so on, to really address this issue. Now, Urs Weber, you may be knowing him. He is the head of the Handelskammer Schweiz, Österreich, Liechtenstein, and he has sent me a question. Could this disaggregated, anonymized data be a third leg, a so-called third leg, a third pillar within Roche, besides pharmaceuticals and diagnostics?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And
excellent idea.
Not only idea. I mean, it's in the making. We did a number of acquisitions in the United States where the environment allows you to develop this kind of solutions. And actually, that has become a business. It's not yet profitable. It's not yet big. But we are heavily investing into it, and if we meet again in a couple of years, and I have in my initial slides a presentation where we have kind of 3 areas, that is pharma diagnostics and something we internally call insights, too small to get over the surface at this time. I would be very, very happy. And I truly believe for Roche, it's an enormous opportunity to bring the synergies together between pharma diagnostics and digital, if you like, and data, because the tech companies, they also go into healthcare a lot, right? They invest a lot into healthcare, but what they lack is the domain knowledge, right? I mean, we just don't know how the healthcare system is working, and they never have this depth, for example, in disease biology, etc. But they are very strong on the digital side, of course, right? The diagnostics companies, they seem not to care about this question at all. And the pharma companies, they typically look at it just as another tool. So they use data for the development of medicines. But if we are successful for building 3 businesses, and bring the synergies together, I think that could be a combination which really could bring us to the next level from a strategic positioning point of view, and which could allow us to drive even more personalized healthcare, even better solutions for patients. Mm-hmm. Very good question.
Severin, actually, I have been looking at my watch, and actually we are more or less, at least formally, running out of time. Would you have some more minutes, or
I'm fine. I'm no other meeting today, so I'm fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Lorenzo De Benedictis, he is a master alumnus from the MCI. I do not know where he is presently, but he has sent me a question that does this so-called virtual arm approach, which you have been presenting in your presentation, consider the currently important topic of gender medicine, for instance, women and the respective medicines?
Yeah, it's a very important point, because I mean, from a pure medical point of view, it's very important that you have a diverse group of patients as part of your trial. And that's true for traditional clinical trials in a regulated or in a very confined setting, but it's also true when you analyze real-world data. Diversity is important, because regulators would look at it and they would say, well, you have shown it in a specific subpopulation, but who tells me that this also works in the real world, where I have the diversity of patient groups? That can be gender, certainly important. That can be ethnic differences, right? And it's also age, for example, is a very important point, right? Because people could respond differently to a medicine depending on how old they are, right? Because the body works differently. And therefore, for us, it's on the one hand very often a regulatory need to do that. And on the other hand, we are also a global company, right? So if you want to go to China and there's no Chinese in the trial, then the Chinese will say, well, sorry, you can't launch this medicine here in my country, right? And if there were no women in a trial, I think we would get troubles with the regulators. So the diversity is very important. And there's a big debate currently in the pharmaceutical industry whether the diversity is sufficiently high. And it was triggered in the US now with Black Lives Matters, because minority groups, which are often underprivileged, right, have often a less good access to medicine. And as a result of it, they are less considered in clinical trials. So we have now an initiative underway of how can we ensure that we get a better diversity also for such underprivileged populations. And the same is true for emerging markets, right? Where sometimes the healthcare structure is not at the same level, and it makes it just much more difficult to conduct a trial or to do this kind of work. So it's a very valid question. It's very relevant for us to do the business. And clearly this is becoming even more relevant these days.
Another question from Ian Wallace. He has a Novartis email address, but I'm sure you will respond to it nevertheless. Now, do you feel that the proposed plans to restrict AI, artificial intelligence usage in Europe, is a benefit or a hurdle for digital health?
Yeah, I mean, listen, on the one hand, it is really, really important to protect data security, to protect data privacy in a sensitive area like healthcare. It is very important to build trust with all the stakeholders and the public. Otherwise, you know, we cannot operate. I mean, that's the fundamentals. But what I experience, and I have to say more in Europe than anywhere else in the world, is there is a lot of irrational emotional discussion, right? There is a fear which is not really defined. I keep saying, if you are in the US And you talk about data. You know, data is a neutral word. It's like paper, you know, it's like glass, table, chair, data, okay, you know, or knife or whatever. It has its use. There might be some risks with it. We have to take care of it, but there's no emotion about it, or less emotion about it, right? Okay. Now, if you come to some European countries, right, and you say the word data, it's like it's getting a bit silent, you know. The light is coming down, you know, the kind of, the clouds are, you feel like the whole atmosphere is kind of getting worse. I mean, if you have data, it's kind of like the devil comes out of the hell. There is an emotion around it, right? It's seen as a threat to start with. It's not seen as an opportunity. And of course, we have to manage the risks. We have to mitigate the risks. And there will always be a residual risk at the end of the day. But we should not forego the opportunities, right? And the reality is, if Europe doesn't do it, I tell you who is going to do it. It will be the Americans and the Chinese, and they will do it according to their regulations. So I strongly advise European policymakers to have a good framework, which is in line with our culture, with our values, but then enable those new technologies. Then we are the master of our own destiny. Otherwise, at the end of the day, we'll end up like in the tech industry, where everybody complains about Google, everybody complains about Microsoft, everybody complains about Apple, or perhaps Alibaba and Tencent, and we all use it, right? And we have no alternative.
And we leave it to them, yep.
And what is in Europe? I mean, I don't see the big tech companies in Europe, right? But we complain and we say we should this and that and what have you. So in healthcare, we still have the opportunity, right? Because healthcare, because it's so much in the Stone Age, right? It's only starting now. There's still the opportunity here. And Europe has a huge hub of the life science industry, a lot of know-how, a really good healthcare system. So here is an opportunity. The problem is just if we are not speeding up, then we'll miss the boat forever, right? And the US is already ahead, and China is working hard in this area, in particular in artificial intelligence, as you know. So we have to enable it whilst we have a solid framework which is in line with our values. You know, as a European, it hurts me when I see what's going on. As a company CEO, actually, I don't care, because I go where I can do my business. You know, I go to the US primarily now, and we have some projects in China, and we try hard in Europe. But in relative terms, Europe is losing out, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah. Now, Tabea Schöffner, I do not know about her background, but she has sent me two questions. I may put forward one of them. What does it take to successfully equip such a giant company like Roche for the digital age? To equip such a giant for the digital age?
It's a huge mindset shift. I mean, we live in the physical world. You know, we know how to build diagnostics instruments. We have engineers, we have biologists, we have chemists who are at the very top in their respective field. But, you know, if you're a young student and you are a coder or interested in artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., I mean, who thinks of Roche, right? I mean, you think of Google, of Microsoft, of the tech players, etc. That's where you would go typically, right? So for us, it's a lot about positioning ourselves, making sure that we get the right talent, the right capabilities on board. And there is also other cultural elements which are important. For example, in the pharmaceutical world, it's a world where you think about your own proprietary data. We talked about clinical trials, right? So now if you do a clinical trial, and that's, you know, it's all about data and analyzing this data for our purposes to develop a medicine. What you do is you have a contract with a hospital, with an investigator, as we call it, who performs the clinical trial, and we pay them for doing the trial. And in return, they provide all the services, and at the end we get the data, right? But it's our data, right? So we own the data. It's literally our data. We own them, right? It's a very proprietary model. And what you take care of is you protect it and do all kinds of things. Now, if you enter into the world of real world data, then you cannot own the real world data. I mean, they're owned by the patient, right? And the hospitals and the doctors have a say here. And you cannot just go there and say, this is, I mean, you can buy all the hospitals in the world, but that's not possible. And it wouldn't make sense either. So suddenly, the moment you go into real world data, you need open platforms. You know, you need ecosystems. You have to completely open up. And I tell you, this is mentally a huge shift, right? If you come from a world where you protect everything which you have paid for, now suddenly you go into partnerships and cooperations where you have to share data, right? That's often part of it. You know, we give you our data, you give and so on. That's a new world for us, and it's a real mindset shift. So you need the technology, you need the capabilities, but it's also about attitude and mind shift and how you work together with the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Do I already have bad feelings about the time, or are you still okay?
No, I'm fine. As long as the audience is
coming in over and over. And another very nice question now. Julian Hellweger, he has also sent me a number of them, but I have been, looking at my screen. I hope I wasn't unpolite, just trying to select questions. Now, how would you rate the holistic Chinese full body approach to treat diseases with natural medicines? Does Roche has projects to implement this kind of treatments? Julian Hellweger.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is the question about what is called traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, and we as a company are not directly active in this, but the underlying thought of it, that you look at the human being holistically, right, is the right approach, because we know that there's so many interdependencies, and you cannot just look at one organ without being aware of other things which are going on. I mean, something which we all know is the placebo effect, for example, right? When we do clinical trials, you have this placebo effect where people respond suddenly to a medicine, but we know it was just sugar, right? So that tells you that at the end of the day, we really don't know enough, and we have to be really open, and we should never think that our approach is the right one, right? And in this sense, I would say, yeah, let's be open to see whether what we can learn. On the other hand, I also have to say that at the end of the day, we can only bring a medicine to the market and convince regulators if we have data, right? So if it's just tradition, but we cannot translate that into scientific insights, I think it's difficult for us to leverage it. And it might be because it's simply not true, and there is nothing. It might also be that we don't yet understand it. But either way, it wouldn't help us to bring new medicines and new solutions to patients. So we very much focus on what you would probably call traditional medicine. But what you should also see is the Chinese are really catching up in the life science industry, and they are copying the Western world, and they are putting a lot of money into classic data-driven research and development, and traditional Chinese medicines. Has a big also cultural role in China, but if you look where the money is going, right, the hard dollars are flowing, billions literally. It goes exactly into the research and development which we are doing in Europe and in the United States. So don't underestimate what kind of innovation will come from this part of the world.
Severin, I'm not sure whether I've ever told you that I was born and raised on a farm, and then on a dairy farm, and the veterinarians, the animal doctors, they have always been saying that the best medical doctors are actually them. themselves, because there is no placebo effect with animals. So they have the best data, the best experience, differently from human medicine.
Interesting. Yeah.
You may want to comment on that or just leave it out. I have another question from Roland Stahlinger, Dr. Roland Stahlinger. He works with Sandoz and is supposedly the lead oncology affairs, global medical affairs lead oncology. I'm not sure whether you know him. Obviously this is the case. And he has sent me a question. The better we get in healthcare, and the better we target it, the higher the cost and the more difficult is access on a global scale. Isn't there a paradox besides the fact that the gain in survival or QOL is, at least for some molecules, limited when we consider the price tag? For me, it's quite a complex question, but I'm sure you know how to deal with it.
No, I think I know what the background of the question is. And I would answer it in two ways. So first of all, what is the underlying assumption here? The assumption is if you have more targeted medicines, right, your patient group gets smaller and smaller, right? So instead of developing one medicine for millions of patients, you suddenly have to develop potentially thousands of medicines for very small patient groups. And, the concern, which is a widespread concern with payers in particular, they say, well, as a result of that, healthcare will get better and better and better. Now, I would make two answers to that. First of all, of course, a dead patient is the cheapest patient. If somebody dies, a funeral cost, and that was it, right? And the earlier the person dies, the better. So what I'd say is that yes, healthcare has a cost, and if we have better solutions, and that's not only about medicines, that's about surgical solutions, that's about new diagnostics, that's about many things, of course. Then we live longer, life expectancy goes up, and hopefully we live more healthy lives when we age. And think back about our grandparents, what kind of healthcare they had, and think what the life expectancy was. If somebody is 60 or 70 today, that's kind of, you can still do a lot of things, right? 50 years ago, you were, that was really old, really old. So you can say, well, it's cheaper if people die earlier, no doubt, and if you don't have any medicines, but there's a price to pay for it, and that's a longer, better life, right? And then the question, of course, of societies is, how much do you want to invest into healthcare, right? Or how much can you afford to invest into healthcare? And if you look into the Western world, this is typically about 12, 13%. There are differences. Some countries it's a bit lower, some countries it's a bit higher, but it's in this range. And I would argue, and call me biased, I am probably, I think it's worth it, right? When we can cover many other needs like shelter, and we can do our, holidays, and we have a place to live, and we have food, etc. What is the last bottleneck in life? It's health, right? And to spend 15% as a society, that's what we spend relative to GDP, right? To spend for healthcare, it seems okay to me. It's a personal judgment. What is the value of life? What is the price of life? You don't have an objective answer to that. I would say it's worth that, right? Now, I should also say medicines make about 10 to 15% of total healthcare costs. Okay. So it's perhaps 1 to 2% of total GDP. Now, if you look at what a value those medicines bring to society, again, call me biased, but I would put it into perspective, and I would say it's worth it, right? Of course, the alternative is we live not so long lives, we live lives in a different quality of life, and then we have more money to eat more, we have more money to make more holidays, Sure, you know, I have my view on that. So this is my first answer, right? Now, the second answer is, and that's something which is always forgotten in the debate when we talk about prices of medicines and more personalized, targeted medicines, at some point, patents expire, right? Mm-hmm. And the moment the patent expires, right, those medicines are available forever for mankind at a very, very low cost. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the value of a medicine beyond the patent life, mm-hmm. which is typically about 10 years. The patent is 20 years. You need 10 years to develop a medicine. You have another 10 years to commercialize it, right? So if you look beyond that, then actually it's a really, really good investment for human mankind. But of course, a politician or a Krankenkasse, you can be happy if they think for 3 years, but they certainly don't think for 50 years. You know, that's the nature. If a politician wants to be re-elected in 4 years. But I think we wouldn't do ourselves a favor as society if we are not willing to invest into innovation, because the ones who will benefit from that are actually our children. As we benefited from all the investments our grandparents did, and my predecessor did at Roche, when life expectancy was still much lower. So that's I rest my case. But I fully admit, I'm not right or wrong. That's a judgment call. And the society has to decide how important healthcare is.
Thank you so much, Severin. And perhaps 2 or 3 more questions, and then I think I really need to be polite and leave you out for the evening. But Paul Unterlugauer, which I think is a very interesting question, because he comes to the importance of the linkage between academia and the industries. And his question goes, I think Mr. Schwan is totally right that research is the most important point for innovation, but why are big manufacturing locations far away from universities, for example, in Kundl-Schaftenau or in Penzberg?
Right.
Nice question.
Yeah, I mean, my first answer would be for a well-established process, right? When you have you know, a product which is produced at high volumes with a standard process, etc., it's not so critical to have it very close to research, right? Because then it gets almost like a commodity, and it's a lot about manufacturing efficiency. And then you go where you find the right people, and often you go where you can do it at reasonable cost, right? Mm-hmm. Where it is critical is if you develop a new manufacturing process where the cooperation with the development and the research world is still very important. And the way we do that at Roche is for these early, we call it scale-up manufacturing activities, where we establish processes, etc. Actually, those we have very close to our research and development site. So we have them in our research site in San Francisco. We have them in Basel, for example. It's pretty expensive because these are, you know, high-price environments, etc. But it's worth it because this interaction is important. And by the way, in Penzberg, we have also research and development, and therefore, actually, we have this synergy, right? And Penzberg is not at the end of the world, I should say. You know, it's about half an hour from Munich. You know, in America, this is a district of a big city. It's a village, but it's very close to Munich. And Munich, again, is an area where there's a lot ongoing in terms of research and development. But then when it comes to a routine manufacturing process, you can put the factory actually everywhere in the world.
Severin, I have been reading on my screen and hopefully not being unpolite to the audience, but I will bring together 3 or 4 questions in one. And the senders are Michael Wernley. He is a doctoral student at the University of Innsbruck and then MCI alumnus. And also Christoph Griesbeck, he's the head of Department of Biotechnology at the MCI. And also, let me see who else, do not forget them. Where did I? Yeah, there he is. Paul Schweiger and Pablo Lopez Lazaro. They are, all of them are related to the MCI, either as MCI alumni or the department head, Professor Griesbeck. And actually, the question goes like this, put together. What advice would you give young students or early career alumni when they want to enter a career, and even more so a management career? And the background of it is that we have been enjoying also a very nice collaboration with Roche, especially with Roche Bensberg, we, the MCI, bringing expertise from Roche to the MCI and expertise, research expertise and talents to Roche. And more or less the similar model is true with Sandoz, obviously, in Kundelschaften now. Now, what would you advise to young, to early career alumni?
I would focus on two things. One is curiosity and being open-minded. I mean, the world is changing so much, and what is true today is perhaps not true tomorrow. And you have to constantly adapt, and you have to find your way, right? But you can only do that if you're really curious, and if you really kind of, want to see different things, learn different things, always challenge yourself, etc. And I think that's almost like a prerequisite. Don't be afraid of not being curious and experiment. Don't go too early, too specific. Explore the world first. Like children do. The children are so curious, right? And I think adults, they lose this curiosity. I mean, they ask questions all the time. They play around. They try all kind of stuff. And I think we should never lose that. And it's in particular important at the beginning of a career, because at the beginning of your career, you're finding your way. And if you go too early into one direction, where perhaps you don't even know yet what you want, or what you wanted is not relevant anymore because the world is changing, then you lose a lot of opportunities. So I would say that's something. Kind of never feel obliged to kind of specialize or do this or that. Kind of be open. That's one thing. The second thing is, and I experienced this, I'd say, I mean, almost on a day, at least on a weekly basis, I experienced this. And that is the following. You have great talent, right? We are always looking for people to be developed, to take over more responsibility, also people responsibility, etc. And there's always a scarcity, right, of talent. It's always the same. Yeah. And then you say, well, that's really we think great talent, right? And then we talk with the person, and we say, well, would you like to take over this or that role, right? And then suddenly people have thousands of reasons why they don't do it, right? And what it is, it's fear. It's fear. Or put it positively, it's a lack of courage. So the moment an interesting role comes up, they have to leave their comfort zone. I mean, you take over risks, you suddenly should take over a leadership role, and you never had responsibility to lead a team. This can be frightening. Theoretically, as long as you're a student, this is great, and you have your management theory, etc. But then in practice, if you are offered the first job, that's a different story, right? Now suddenly I'm responsible for it. And then a lot of people hesitate. Now, in an international environment like Roche, also the geographic dimension is important, because the jobs are not always kind of in your home village, right? Interesting opportunities, they might come up somewhere in the world. And we also like it if people go a bit across the world and get different perspectives. So you go to the people who always claimed on their CV that they are fully mobile, right? Completely mobile. And then you go there and you say, well, we have an opening up now in whatever, Norway or South Africa or the US or China or whatever, right? And then suddenly it's getting real, right? And this kind of, I'm mobile, I want to see the world. The initial curiosity is there, but then when you get the offer, the courage is gone. And people kind of have fear like crazy. And then they say, no, I can't do it. I have my family, my friends, I don't know. The classic excuse, to tell you a little secret, is the grandmother. Now, why? Because a grandmother, which is very ill and has to be taken care of, you almost have an emotional responsibility to take care of her. And the nice thing with your employer is you kind of keep the optionality, because the grandmother will die anyway very soon. So come back to me again if you have another offer. There's a significant percentage of people who suddenly have a grandmother who is in big difficulties. Now, we would not check on that, and I'm not sure what I would always find about that. What it is a lack of courage. And you know, the thing is, you only live once. Right? I mean, if hopefully with our medicines we get 100, and one day with 100 years you lie on your bed and you know the life is coming to an end, and then you reflect on your life and you say, I missed this opportunity, and I didn't do this, and I didn't open up my startup, and I didn't want to go to this country, and I didn't want to go into this new function, and I was afraid of taking leadership experience, and now I regret it all. On that day, it is too late. So my strong advice for everybody who is interested in making something out of your life, that's basically what it is. Remain your curiosity and have the courage to put your dreams into action, give it a chance. And if you fail, then fail and try it again. But if you don't give it a chance, you will never know whether it will work out.
What a wonderful final statement. Thank you so much, dear Severin Schwan, Dr. Severin Schwan, Chief Executive of Roche Group, for taking so much time. You have gifted us with a wonderful late afternoon, or actually more an early evening now. Thank you so much for being our distinguished guest today. And if we can at all pay back somehow with talent, with engagement, with research, with motivation, whatever, I'd be more than pleased to give back, to create impact and also in transforming Austria when it comes to, curiosity and to Europe with data, with less of emotion and more pragmatic and get it done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas. It was a pleasure to join. Thank you very much.
And lots of luck for the next years and for all the challenges about to come. Now, also thank you out there in the audience. Thanks to our alumni, our students. Thanks to the many media partners, Tiroler Tageszeitung, Südtiroler Wirtschaftszeitung, Die Presse, Die Deutsche Wirtschaft, Industriegespräche, Industriellenvereinigung Tirol, Handelskammer Schweiz, Österreich, Liechtenstein, ESMT Berlin, one of the leading business schools in Europe, Sana Kliniken, and so on. And the last slide, when the two of us are not on the screen anymore, will be this chart. You will see the upcoming events. The next one on Monday will be Martin Kocher, our Federal Minister of Labor, and then Astrid Hamka, Frank Sieren talking about China, Astrid Hamka on entrepreneurship. So enjoy, be our guest, and thank you so much for paying attention to this event. Thanks again, Severin.